Welcome to Lecture 28, which will be on heat acclimation. If you remember Lecture 27, we talked about the challenges to homeostasis faced by the body during exercise, particularly in regards to thermal regulation. So the body experiences a heat load, and then there is a challenge to both metabolism, to the cardiovascular system, and to the regulatory mechanisms that will maintain normal body temperature. Of course, repeated over time, multiple exposures to hot environments while exercising will result in some adaptations, and that's what we'll talk about today, and that is indeed the definition of heat acclimation. That is those physiological responses to those repeated exposures that then lessen the physiological challenge. I'll remind us once again here are the photos of the Badwater Ultramarathon, which takes place in Death Valley. And again, temperatures here can reach upwards near 130 degrees. These people, to complete this race, must be very well acclimated to this very hot environment. So let's take a look about how they might do this. Obviously, to promote heat acclimation, the person has to be exposed to hot environments for long periods of time, repeatedly. And not only that, but they also have to exercise. So yes, you could just go lay out in the sun and increase your body temperature by a few degrees, and that would yield some heat acclimation. But you have to exercise in order to improve your performance in the heat, because those episodes of repeated exercise will increase your temperature even more. The primary adaptations that occur with heat acclimation are an increased plasma volume, an earlier onset of sweating, a higher sweat rate, reduced salt loss in sweat, that would include sodium and potassium, reduced skin blood flow, and an increased synthesis of heat shock proteins. We'll take a look at the first 5 responses here, and we'll sort of ignore the heat shock proteins, mostly because the book doesn't give us any real physiological effect of that response. Let's take a look at some of these mechanisms in more detail, and then we'll build a story about how heat acclimation can improve exercise performance in the heat. The first figure to cover is actually not from our textbook, but I like some of the things it has to show, so I wanted to include it here. This is a study of runners running in the heat for 3 consecutive days, and it was above 90 degrees. On the x-axis you can see there are days, and then the y-axis is the percent change of these various blood measurements. So what they did was they took 3 consecutive days of measurements at first, simply the baseline, and that's on days 1, 2, and 3. And then they started exercising. They did 3 days of exercise in the heat in a row, and then they did 3 days of not exercising, or maybe it was 4 days of not exercising. And so what you can see is plasma volume at days 4, 5, and 6, they increased by 20%. And that's only in 3 days. And then, in the latter 3 days of without running, we lose the entire 20% increase in plasma volume. Concurrently, they also measured red cell volume, or red blood cell volume. And this would be simply your number of red blood cells. Now, of course, since these are cells, it stays constant. The number of red blood cells isn't going to change dramatically in just a few days. But because there was an increase in plasma volume, we now see the decrease in hemoglobin and hematocrit, of course, because as plasma volume goes up, and if red cell volume stays the same, the hematocrit, or the percentage of that volume that's made up of red blood cells, that's going to decrease. And it does. So in addition to the changes in blood volume, or specifically plasma volume, what we also see is how rapid these changes can occur. So within 3 days, we have this large increase in plasma volume, and then another 3 days of rest shows it goes back to normal. So these are fairly quick adaptations. That point brings us to the next figure, which is one from your book. This is figure 12.13. And so this shows the time course of changes after exercising in the heat. And you can see, starting at about 3 days, we will have measurable decreases in heart rate, in and changes in plasma volume. By 4 or 5 days, your perceived exertion will start to go down, and the sweat rate will increase by 7 days, 8 days, and the entire thing might be complete within 2 weeks. So heat acclimation does not take long. The last figure from our textbook that I'll show is figure 12.14, and the two diagrams here show the changes in heart rate and core temperature that we see in a 60-minute exercise bout, both before and after acclimation. Heart rate clearly decreases, is lower at each time point after acclimation. Now this, of course, is going to be primarily reflective of the larger increase, the increase in plasma volume. So with greater plasma volume, you can get more venous return. That will yield a larger stroke volume, which then therefore will allow for a lower heart rate. And then the diagram on the right shows the change in core temperature. So after acclimation, of course, it's lower at every time point, which would make sense with all of those mechanisms that change in regards to heat acclimation, especially the earlier onset and greater volume of sweat. And so that just enhances the evaporative cooling. So now that we've seen some of these basic mechanisms for acclimation, let's take this a step further beyond our textbook and look at how this will affect then performance in, say, an endurance event in a hot and humid environment. What we're going to see is the primary adaptations are, of course, in the cardiovascular system. So what I'd like to do for this section is to draw a series of graphs. And let's start with what would happen with blood volume over time. So let's say we're doing a prolonged exercise bout in the heat, maybe an hour or two, some prolonged exercise. And let's see what happens with blood volume. So here we have a graph with time on the x-axis and blood volume on the y, and a non-acclimated athlete doing this prolonged exercise bout, you'd see blood volume decline over time as they were sweating. And that's the non-acclimated athlete. An acclimated athlete, of course, will start out with a higher blood volume because of the training and the acclimation. And then even if they had the same rate of decline, throughout the duration of the bout, they would have a greater blood volume. And that is the acclimated person. So let's take another look at another cardiovascular variable, this time stroke volume. This pattern will, of course, look similar to blood volume. So a non-acclimated person has some stroke volume, and it will decrease over time as the person loses blood volume to sweating for one, and skin blood flow will demand a higher and higher portion of the cardiac output. So stroke volume will decrease over time. That's the non-acclimated person. In the acclimated person, of course, it will be higher stroke volume at first. Why? Because they have a larger blood volume, and it will stay higher. Because again, a larger total blood volume because they are heat acclimated. Next, let's take a look at heart rate. We know that in a prolonged exercise bout, especially one in the heat, the athletes will have an increase in heart rate over time. And so let's say that's our non-acclimated person. In fact, let me draw this a little bit differently. Let's draw this so it increases more rapidly and even plateaus a bit as they reach a near maximal heart rate. That will be the non-acclimated person. The acclimated person is going to have a lower heart rate, and perhaps it does something like that. The reason for the lower heart rate in the acclimated person is, of course, they have a larger blood volume to begin with, which allows for a larger stroke volume, and so they can maintain cardiac output by having a lower heart rate. The next cardiovascular response we can look at will be cardiac output. And over time, of course, in the non-acclimated person, if they're reaching a maximum heart rate and stroke volume continues to decline, then over time, cardiac output will also go down. That would be in the non-acclimated person. Which means, of course, if their cardiac output is going down, their performance is suffering. They're probably slowing down as well, because if you think this is a bike ride or a run, they will be slowing down. The acclimated person may see a slight reduction, but it won't be as much, right? Because again, they will have less cardiovascular strain, they'll have a lower heart rate, and a higher stroke volume. One way to think of cardiovascular strain is to consider heart rate. Anytime we get up to a near maximum heart rate, there's nowhere else to go performance-wise. The system simply cannot respond. Your heart rate won't continue to beat faster and faster and faster. There will be a maximum, and once you hit it, even if you're at what it seems to be a sub-maximal effort, your body just won't be able to push any harder. Next, let's look at how skin temperature might change over time. In your non-acclimated person, it will increase. And of course, it will also increase in your acclimated person, but here it's going to increase less. The reason for that is because remember the sweating response. The acclimated person is going to have an earlier onset of sweating and a larger sweat rate. That will keep the skin cooler, and so the temperature of the skin will not rise as much. And finally, for our last graph, let's look at changes in skin blood flow over time. This is also going to increase as body temperature increases over the duration of the exercise bout. And so in your non-acclimated person, you might look something like that. Whereas in the acclimated person, we think, oh, if they have higher cardiac output or they're more acclimated, they should have higher skin blood flow. But they don't. They have lower skin blood flow. Why? Because if you remember back to the previous graph, the skin temperature is lower. With a lower skin temperature, skin blood flow can be lower to the skin because the conductive and convective cooling will be enhanced because skin temperature is less. And so we can get rid of just as much heat with a lower blood flow. And now if we think back to the cardiovascular responses, it sort of all seems to make sense, right? If you have cooler skin when you are acclimated, you have lower skin blood flow. That means a higher percentage of cardiac output can go to the active muscles, and you also will have a larger blood volume near the core, that is near the heart. That gives you a greater venous return, which gives you larger stroke volume. So this all enhances cardiovascular function, right? And again, it goes back to that combination of having a larger stroke volume and then the sweating response, which is more effective for thermal regulation. You could even think about taking this one step further and doing another graph. I won't do it, but if you had muscle blood flow and it was near max and a prolonged exercise bout, you could imagine that over time the muscle blood flow would go down in the non-acclimated athlete who is now sending a lot of blood to the skin, who doesn't have as much blood volume to start with, and who's sweating a lot, right? So all of those things will cause the non-acclimated person to fatigue sooner. So to conclude this lecture on heat acclimation, here are just some of the things to think about as a study guide. What are the primary physiological adaptations that occur during heat acclimation? How does this acclimation enhance endurance performance in the heat? And then how does one achieve heat acclimation? And that will conclude Lecture 28.